everybody, and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here, and I'm joined by Don as usual. Today is the long-awaited Subliminal Jihad You Can't Win crossover episode. We have both co-hosts from that excellent podcast on to talk about a very interesting book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by Carl Oglesby. This is a book that was written in like the 60s, came out in the late 60s or early 70s, something like that. And the basic premise is that the American ruling class or the ruling elites are divided into two camps, the Yankees and the Cowboys. So we're going to talk about that idea and maybe try to critique it a little bit. We've kind of looked around and found some interesting critiques of the idea as well. So it should be an interesting one. This is a book that I have been wanting to read for a very long time. It kind of came on my radar years ago, and I've just never been able to get a chance to read it. But these guys have, so they're going to talk us through it. So, yeah, welcome to the podcast, Dimitri, and welcome back, Khalid.
Yeah, happy to be back.
Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Hey. Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us about this book, The Yankee and Cowboy War?
Okay. So, The Yankee and Cowboy War, it's something I stumbled upon a few years ago. It was written, I think, in 1976 by a former SDS activist and journalist named Carl Oglesby. It was after he had left the SDS. And he kind of posited it's one of the first attempts to kind of integrate a kind of class analysis and a conspiracy analysis into a lot of the political events and upheavals of the 60s and 70s. And his basic thesis is that both the assassination of JFK and the Watergate scandal that took down Nixon were part of a kind of intra-class feud between the two dominant kind of class, economic, social, political class formations, which he terms the Yankees, which are basically the northeastern industrial banking establishment, and the Cowboys, who were kind of the Texas oil billionaires, Southwestern defense contractors, things of that nature, who kind of can trace their lineage to some extent back to the vanquished Southern aristocracy and also like the Western robber baron pioneers. And so, yeah, that's his basic thesis, is that the cowboy faction of the American ruling class was the driving force behind assassinating Kennedy. And then the Yankee class sort of got their revenge in the early 70s by concocting the Watergate scandal to basically take down Nixon. And yeah, that's kind of the long and short. I mean, he goes into a lot of evidence about the JFK assassination. That's pretty good stuff, and about Watergate connections like Howard Hughes and E. Howard Hunt and his wife, and just all kinds of shenanigans. I think it does a great job of saying that these things were conspiracies, and then he offers this kind of meta class analysis of these are the real fault lines and friction points of, you know, how power is kind of distributed, and kind of pushes against it's kind of a pluralist theory, but it's more of an elite pluralist, like conspiratorial kind of theory. I think he said that at one point that conspiracy is like the continuation of policy by like normal means, or clandestinism is something like that. Like it's basically standard operating procedure, even if these people sometimes aren't fully self-aware to the extent at which that they are conspiring with one another. But yeah, right. I don't know if
one of the most one of the parts of this book that really sticks with me is, you know, trying to defend the concept, because even at the time, you know, the idea of conspiracy was controversial, and it had this negative connotation that it has now. When people think suggest that there's a conspiracy, then that is seen as being paranoid or irrational or crazy, you know.
I mean, that term, conspiracy theory, I believe, was essentially popularized after the JFK assassination as a means of anything that went against the official government story was, that's just a conspiracy theory, you know, that's not
that's literally
it was
true,
a deliberate like intel strategy, more not just like even at a media level, but, you know, within the intel agencies themselves, they popularized that term. But something story that he tells is when he's talking about this idea of a conspiracy among these, or the phenomenon of conspiracy and conspiring among these groups. He's talking to a group of sort of high-end business people, and they're all very incredulous, and they're like, are you suggesting there's a conspiracy at the highest levels? And he sort of asks, well, what about like at your jobs? Like, don't you feel that there's all this sort of dealing? And they're like, yeah, of course. And they start like talking and going on about like, plotting against their coworkers and all those schemes that go on and things like that. But like for some reason, like at a certain point, there's like this horizon of disbelief where like once it gets to a certain level or a certain level of political advancement or power, then it's not conceivable anymore.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, right? Once the stakes get higher, then people are less likely to conspire and plot. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Or is our favorite quote about conspiracy? I think it was by C. Derek Varn on the Zero Books podcast. We've kind of ragged on it a couple times, but he advanced this very confident theory that conspiracies of groups greater than 50 people are kind of categorically impossible because more than 50 people can't keep a secret. So you can just write it off. Like, nothing over 50.
Once you hit 51, that's when it all falls apart. Like, literally the 51st person, that's where you introduce.
He walks in like, hey, what's going on, guys? Talking about something?
Yeah, exactly. Like,
we just got to find those 49 guys who did 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
That reminds me of a quote from Michael Parenti when he was talking about something similar about like conspiracy theories and stuff, and he said that whenever people approach him about this kind of stuff, they always say, do you think these guys get together in rooms and talk about this kind of stuff? Like do they really have these rooms where they are getting in like to conspiracy? And he would always go and tell them, of course they meet in rooms. Where else would they meet? He's like,
no, really, even if you say smoke-filled room, that sets something off in people that like that's not true. But it's like, well, I don't know. People smoked back then, and they were in rooms. Like,
exactly.
It's like, and there's so many stories of that literally happening. Going back to like the Boss Tweed machine and everything. This is a. I mean that's the thing that I think is interesting about Yankee and Cowboy War is it shines a spotlight on these older kind of economic networks of power that have been around for such a long time. And I think just by extrapolating it back to the Civil War, that's a very intellectually stimulating move to make that I think can kind of bear some fruit. Even if I don't fully, I don't know, I have my kind of picadillos with maybe the finer points of his theory, especially when we've tried to apply the rubric to things that are going on maybe from the 80s to today. It's always like there's some aspect of the Yankee Cowboy dialectic that does map onto it, but then there's like these contradictions that don't quite fit. And so, I don't know. I think,
Yes, I mean, there's lots of like granular distinctions in it. I think that, he does clarify that even though he uses the Southern aristocracy as an example, and there are elements of it that are incorporated into the sort of cowboy formation or the cowboy block. There is a difference where this develops more recently as it exists today. So there's a little bit of granularity, and I do appreciate that aspect of it. Like, again, there's definitely flaws, and especially as like something that is just broadly applied, there's lots of situations where this doesn't quite hold up as the ultimate like total explanation for everything, or the like master hermeneutic for like all American politics. Like, definitely I would say no, but it is valuable in the respect that it pushes back, as we just said, against the idea that there's no such thing as people making a plan in a room or a conspiracy with more than 50 people, and also against the idea on the other side of the ruling elite as being a homogenous group. Because I think that fundamental idea, I think that it would even take it to a higher level than just the Yankee Cowboy split. There's splits like within those factions. It's like actually like a hyper fractalization of factions. Like, that's really how I feel that it works. But the idea of this, all the elites as being homogenous or like having class solidarity, like they do to a point, but it's much more complex than that. And a lot of the time, even when they do seem to converge, they believe that they're working against each other, and through their competition, they arrive at some kind of convergence.
Yeah, that last point, that has always bugged me about the way people talk about certain things. Like the U.S. is doing this, they want to do this, or the CIA did this, and they have these interests. Like, there's factions within all these groups. You can't really talk. I mean, you can say the CIA did something if you understand also that there are like, what are you specifically referring to? Like there are certain factions in it. Like there are, to use this vocabulary, there are cowboy factions and there are Yankee factions, right?
Yeah. That's even a common term, I think, that I've heard, ex-CIA people use about the operations division versus the analyst division. The nickname of the operations people are cowboys, basically. Yeah. So
interesting.
Yeah. So and it was kind of a lot of these people that I think are even mentioned in Oglesby's book. Even though you get into kind of a strange mix where you get these kind of CIA cowboys, in one sense, going around kind of doing the Bay of Pigs and training these anti-Castro Cubans, but a lot of them, people like, for example, Richard Bissell, ended up being like the chairman of the Ford Foundation, which was a pretty liberal, soft empire, very kind of Rockefeller Council on Foreign Relations kind of organization, and doing a lot of stuff on the more
Yankee stuff.
Yeah, classic Yankee. And he was a skull and bonesman from Yale, who I found that Richard Bissell's grandfather was in the Yale graduating class of 1844 with George H.W. Bush's grandfather and Allen Dulles' grandfather. All of their grandfathers were in the same class at Yale in 1844. So, it's like, even if he was running around Bissell, maybe doing some cowboy stuff with these, anti-Castro Cubans and stuff, it doesn't get more Yankee than that, right?
Sure.
So, but that's something we could circle back to later in terms of my kind of, I don't know, slight critiques. But I still think, I don't know, it's a whole interesting framework.
Yeah, it is. I mean, because you can look at that like an individual. It's not like they are going to self-identify with one or the other team. They don't have uniforms and they don't keep score. You know what I mean? Like they're just kind of looking out for whatever seems appealing to them for whatever reason. And that may kind of switch sides. They may kind of play for the Yankees a little bit, then play for the Cowboys or whatever. Like it's and even those factions, it's probably not a hard distinction all the time. They may even come together on things at times. It's more just like the way I see it. And again, I haven't read the book, but just like this idea has always been very interesting to me since I heard of the book. That like you were talking about the socioeconomic basis for each of the factions. I think that kind of helps to understand like the contradictions within the ruling elite, and then how people are going to play that is going to differ depending on their particular interests and their position within that game. So I don't know, very interesting stuff.
I think that it's very interesting in terms of like the identification. I think that there is like sort of, I mean, people don't generally use these terms. People don't self-identify as like I'm a Yankee or I'm a cowboy, because really I feel like they're almost pejorative in a way, where someone in one faction might be able to objectify someone in the opposite faction. Where I think there is like a sense, like, among people who are cowboy aligned, to use like a contemporary example of like, owning the based, or, like a based person, like owning the PMC Atlanticists or something like that,
right.
Like, and of course the opposite. And I think that in terms of movement across that, there's also a sense of, and you see this a lot whenever there's this kind of like dialectic of self and other that is at play at all. People are always appropriating from like whatever is objectified as the other, like they're always saying like, oh, well, they, like our enemy, they do this, so like we have to do that, like whether or not it's even a true thing or like it's just a projection of what they feel that the enemy is doing, then they want to appropriate that idea for themselves. And there's like many examples of this,
Yeah, kind of an anti tendency, like a knee-jerk sort of thing. It kind of reminds me how some of the people that were Yankees that were hovering around, say, the Ford Foundation, and were also, wrapped up with like Kennedy and everything, they kind of looked upon, they kind of recoiled against McCarthyism, it seems, to a point, but it's not because, as maybe the John Birch Society would have said, that they were pro-communist. They were kind of more at most or at best, you could say maybe like anti-communists to some extent, of like, hey, like don't like throw all my cool Hollywood friends in jail just because they flirted with the Communist Party in the 30s, man. What the hell, And I think that they saw that that approach was maybe doing more harm than good to their particular interests, and I do think that there's something to the idea that because I think when you're talking about the overall American ruling class, they had to make some very big decisions during the Cold War era, bigger than they'd ever made before, on like a global scale that, could either, I don't know, like make America sink or swim. This is a huge global political economic struggle going on. So I could see how the Yankees at a certain point, and Oglesby makes this point pretty well, that they were not anti going to Vietnam in kind of the beginning. They weren't as down with it, but at the same time, like basically they were interested in winning the Vietnam War up to a point. And Oglesby talks about the fascination with special war that JFK and his people had, which sounds... that's one of those things that echoes so well to like Obama and modern Democrats and the kind of more like Atlantic Council kind of and then you can even look at like the Bush era in like the second Iraq War as being this like archetypal cowboy approach of like, we're gonna go like blaze trails and shock and awe and settle the new frontier. And there was a kind of similarity where at a certain point that caused certain negative externalities for America, and particularly made us lose a little bit of it strained the relations with Europe, which I think Oglesby was correct in pointing out that was kind of of primary importance to the Northeastern elites, was we have to be mindful of these Europeans. And I think what you see with the more Southwestern people, and, maybe Oglesby like over-determines it a little bit, but that they have kind of a more like, yo, fuck Europe kind of attitude. You even saw it with Trump. Like, why do we need NATO? Fuck NATO.
Right.
Like these little freeloaders, I don't care about them. And instead, they were much more... Oglesby kind of does. He does a little like psychoanalyzing of this class. And I think there is something to it. He talks a lot about the frontier mentality and how the people in the West and the Southwest and stuff, in some cases descended directly from more recent, settlers, basically. Settler colonialists, and they kind of wanted to keep expanding the frontier out to Vietnam, to Central America, to Cuba, to South America, to Africa, and all these things. And basically it's not that the Yankees were opposed to that. After all, like they had been totally wrapped up in Manifest Destiny and settling the West and all that stuff as well, and financed it a lot. Eastern banks were instrumental, but it wasn't as existential for them necessarily that we needed to conquer a new frontier to prove that like whatever, or else, we were going to feel like we were punking out in front of the world and that, we were showing weakness or whatnot. So I think there's something to that psychological angle and a genuine, like a dispositional sort of thing where... And maybe it comes down to money, too. That's the other important thing, is that these defense contractors stood to gain very immediately from the Vietnam War. And then I believe there were issues with, like, basically, I think it was with deficit spending, because we hadn't abandoned the gold standard yet. And, like, balance of payments issues connected to Vietnam spending that were kind of messing with the Eastern banks in a way that they didn't particularly love. Now, of course, I think at the end of the day, these people are probably mostly able to like sit down and settle their differences. But you could kind of see, I mean, these are all a bunch of greedy mega capitalists at the end of the day that are kind of jealously defending their position, in society, in the world, in the economy. So like, yeah, maybe they would get a little bit salty that, oh, okay, so we have to go make ourselves look bad and hurt our economic interests so Bell Helicopter can make $1 billion and Raytheon and Lockheed can totally clean up, and basically you guys can go have your frontier fantasy, and you're not. I think it probably got a little bit contentious and personal, maybe to some extent, because the whole liberal ruling class did turn against Vietnam, but it seems to have been in a very instrumental kind of, okay, we finally concluded this isn't worth it, so now let's like allow a certain level of anti-war sentiment to like flood into the culture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dimitri, that stuff about the frontiersman mentality kind of makes me think of like people like Ted Cruz and how he's always dressing up in like the big hats and the cigars and all this kind of stuff, and just like the really goofy aesthetic or whatever that like Republicans kind of have around that kind of thing of being like the big tough cowboys and all that kind of like. It is sort of I can understand like that cowboy term is like a pejorative thing, but they also seem to like want to project it. Like I think there's something about that.
Yeah. It reminds me of one of the songs I put in as the interlude for our episode. Pretty good country song, but I think the refrain, is like. He ain't a cowboy, he ain't a real one, he's just a city boy in disguise. It's all about some city guy that dresses up like a cowboy and goes down to the honky tonk bar, but everyone can tell he's full of shit. And it made me think of like the Bushes, and we're kind of the ultimate example of that, like the most like blue blood Connecticut Yale family of like Skull and Bones cheerleaders like going down to Texas and like clearing brush off the ranch and stuff.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking of like Ben Shapiro in his hat. Yeah. Like the 10-gallon cowboy hat, like, yeah.
It's also relevant because, I think one time, broken clock twice a day, but the time, I remember in 2016 when Trump started insinuating that Ted Cruz's dad was involved in the JFK assassination. I think he's right. I think he's right. There's a picture, that was in the National Enquirer and stuff, of like Rafael Cruz handing out hands-off Cuba pamphlets with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. And then I found a video from a local news station where the Hands Off Cuba committee like went in for a radio interview. And just as Lee Harvey Oswald's leaving, just behind him is this young dude with kind of these big kind of Dumbo ears and kind of pointy nose. And it's like, oh my God, that's a young Ted Cruz. But, it's obviously his dad. But it's like, and nobody ever talked about that video, which you can go look on YouTube. And then, he fled the country and like went to Canada right after JFK got assassinated. And anyways,
interesting.
Yeah, I think actually like he's a real cowboy, if you know what I mean.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the Bushes and even Trump, I think, like you guys brought this up on your episode, which I thought was really excellent. I really enjoyed the episode you did on this book. The fact that they are, you would have to think of them as Yankees, but they've definitely kind of gone cowboy to some extent. Like you mentioned the Bushes, George Bush going to Texas, Jeb Bush going to Florida, but coming from, like, as you said, that Skull and Bones kind of background with their father, and then Trump obviously being like New York real estate mob guy, that's Yankee stuff. But as far as his politics goes, build the wall, anti-NATO, anti-NAFTA, all this kind of stuff is much more on the cowboy side of things. And yeah it's just it's funny.
It's interesting. That was something that stuck out to me when I was thinking, I think I mentioned this on our episode, that you think of the cowboys and they're characterized in the book as having this frontier mentality and being very focused on maintaining the frontier as central to American identity, and being much more like actually about having like sort of a sovereign American identity than the Yankees, who think of themselves in terms of Europe or as part of sort of like a transatlantic coalition or civilization. It's interesting though the way that it's kind of shifted in a way. I don't know. I think there maybe are ways of thinking that they still have this type of frontier orientation, but the broad themes I see, like in the rhetoric of people who you'd think of as being cowboys, are much more now about closure. Like you mentioned, build the wall, which is, I mean, in some ways, like the frontier and sort of dominating the frontier does involve like the construction of walls and the use of barbed wire and things like that. So maybe they can go hand in hand. But yeah, it's an interesting transformation, I think, in a way, that one that sticks out to me anyway.
Yeah. Don, I'm kind of interested what your thoughts are on all this so far. I think this is all kind of new to you, so I'm just interested what your first impressions are.
Yeah, I was reading a bit about this today, about like the whole breakdown between the two different groups. And I guess I always think of it in terms of like maybe from the other side, like how it affected socialist countries, and like this division in terms of the anti-communist like extremism of the cowboys, and then sort of this realist approach of the Yankees, maybe, of this idea of, like that I sympathize with more, like in terms of being more realistic or something like that, of being like, America is on top, so therefore, of this global order, so therefore it's more like don't rock the boat kind of thing, like don't let it kind of play out, and we'll win the Cold War just by letting it play out, because it's not, we don't have to take giant risks or anything like that, because we're on top. And you get this other side of it, of just being sort of terrified of communism having a chance, at least, like, to take over, like. And anyways, that's the kind of thing that I was thinking about, like, of this, because I feel like you see how socialists react to things. They have their own cliques or whatever within their own political systems that depend on whether or not, like, say, how they can approach the United States as, like, a force in the world and stuff, right? So, like, a lot of socialist leaders would kind of, it's like because of this dynamic or something, at least, they had to play into this in different ways. Like, if you read certain things from socialist countries, like Soviet Union stuff, they would act as if they were, like, terrified of, like, they greatly exaggerated a lot the threat of the United States to them in different ways. In terms of, like, military direct threat or something, because of this kind of, I don't know. Yeah. And and then I try to translate it as well to, like, nowadays, which is harder, but just, like, in terms of, I feel like, people talk more and more about, like, this multipolar world and things like that. And there's this sort of thing that I find frustrating, that they're trying to taking one side or the other in this try to fight, where I feel like, in terms of saying about there's, like, a new Cold War and all this stuff. And again, it's the same kind of thing where it's like, you see people who are on the left who I feel like are playing into this, like, almost like desire anti-communism or something like that. Like, they want the contradictions to get really intense, because they think that somehow that's how they win. They can kind of denounce the more accelerating process of, inter-imperialist rivalry or something like that as a strategy for them to, like, they say that that's their number one fear, but you can kind of tell almost there's, like, this desire underneath it.
Yes.
Of,
it would make things, like, a lot simpler.
Yeah. I find that so interesting, because it really is about, I don't know, like, at what point I cut out earlier in saying this, but yeah, there is so much desire and, like, a libidinal drive towards the other side. I think that plays a role in this sort of Yankee Cowboy thing, insofar as, like, one side being objectified as, like, limp-wristed, Atlanticists, like, PMC types, versus, ignorant savages or whatever from I don't know, who are racist and everything like that. I think that there is a sort of a sense of, for instance, on the left, one might say, like, oh, we need to be like them. We need to not compromise. They never compromise. Like, we can't do that. And, on the right, they're like, oh, they're always canceling us. We need to cancel them. And of course, like, both of these things, like, are perennial, attributes of both sides. And you can see that, across the board, with communism and with capitalism, or with the United States and the Soviet Union, for instance. Like, something that comes up a lot on our show is the topic of mind control and MK Ultra and all of these things. And there is a huge notion within those programs and within those circles that were participating in them, that the Soviet Union was, like, leagues and fathoms ahead in terms of, like, mind control. But, like, really they weren't at all. Like, and eventually they were like, oh, wait, like, we're not. And it's this different pose. And like, so much of this, I think, in terms of, Tom's point about the self-identity, whether people see themselves as being the cowboy, even to the point of, like, Ted Cruz putting on the hat, it's about, like, the idea of the self in relationship to, like, this identified other, which is, like, yeah, as you said, I think, kind of the same way that there's this dialectic of self and other, there's this revulsion and desire, like, for the other, and, against the other as well, like, in these formations of identity, across the board.
And maybe a lot of projection in the mix. We talked about that in relation to MK Ultra and all kinds of other things, of basically, like, the sort of internal explanation, I think, that, kind of flowed out of Alan Dulles' office with MK Ultra to the people that had to know about it was, look, we have discovered the most disturbing things about what the Chinese and the Soviets and the North Koreans are capable to do. So we need to come up with counter weapons that are better, and maybe, if we're lucky, we can get ahead of them. But in reality, like that whole story was kind of a bunch of bullshit, because what happened was, I think they shot down some pilots during the Korean War who were dropping germ warfare on North Korea. And then through a variety of much more kind of mundane, I think, persuasive methods, the communists basically convinced or persuaded these soldiers to go on the radio or go on television, basically confess to dropping germ warfare and, violating like the Nuremberg, convention and blah, blah, blah. And because we couldn't admit that we were, in fact, dropping germ warfare on the DPRK, they had to come up with some kind of explanation of why these guys would be. And of course, it just looked bad that our soldiers were, denouncing the U.S. imperialists or whatnot. And so we came up with, they must have been mind controlled, but then we went and built this vast project and apparatus of social control and mind control and all these things kind of, and I'm sure plenty of people told themselves, well, we got to do this because the communists are doing it. And so I think sometimes you can see, like it spin back around, and like you can use what you think the other person is doing to build your own nefarious project. And I feel like even within the American elites, they do this a lot. Like, you see the liberal hypocrisy all the time of like, basically Trump, like he's such a barbaric, evil piece of shit, blah, blah, blah. But then, when Joe Biden did his first airstrike in like Syria, someone was like, I just slept so well tonight knowing that, our president is just so dignified when he drone strikes like a hospital, so they're kind of absorbing these evil, loathed, barbaric characteristics of the so-called cowboys. It's even almost like I'm almost getting like a alternate personality, like dissociative identity on a class scale kind of vibe. Like, like you project every part of yourself. Because I think when we get into the financial stuff, these people are so intertwined that it's kind of absurd for a Yankee to look down upon a cowboy and act like they have nothing to do with them. Somebody on the highest perch, like to say it's like, well, your great-great-great-grandfather's insurance company like funded the railroad that, JP Morgan was involved in, that bought like 78% of the land in 8 states and now is like connected to a defense contractor that wears a cowboy hat. But you know what I mean? Like, if you want to play that game.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Another great example of this, it's a little bit far afield from what we're talking about, but it does come irresistibly to mind, is the sort of racialist right wing in Western countries and Muslims. Like, they obviously like are at odds, but there's also kind of like a love affair between them. Like one is always trying to I remember there was the white Sharia thing for a while where, like, all these people on Stormfront or wherever, like, we need white Sharia or whatever, and all the white nationalist women were getting mad. It's like, wait, no, like, please. And they're like, no, shut up. Like, you had to go in a burqa and stuff like, And, of course, we have, like, Muslims who are always, like, desiring, of course, to be more like the right wing, and same thing. So, yeah, but they hate each other, of course, but there's also this huge love affair.
Yeah, there's sort of this weird, I see this quite often where people who are kind of aligned that way politically on the right will have this like respect for like social conservative values or whatever that they see represented by Muslims, like as if like they kind of have the image of the barbarian Muslim who lives in a cave and has 20 wives and barters with goats and stuff, and then it like respects that image. Like that's it's at least they're not like these they're at least they're not these like effete urbane city folk who are like corrupting our country. They're standing up for it's
I remember
I always say politics is for perverts and losers, and this is exactly what I mean.
I remember there was a Lauren Southern tweet like not too long ago that was like, I'd rather send my kid to like a Muslim school than a gender school or something like that, and
I've seen a lot of that lately, like in the UK and stuff, like they were like, this Muslim community, like when they came in and tried to like pass, trans rights, they said, if you come back here, we'll kill you. That we need to be more like that or something, like really extreme stories that.
Right.
Yeah. Love to be a tool between these two camps. It's great.
Yeah, right. Between just like the ultimate dialectic of just like flirting. People just go back and forth. It's like, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I was also thinking, as an example of something of the, like to describe what the Yankee mentality was like or something, was like it's like that network speech, right? Like where he goes, the holistic system of dollars and all that stuff. Yeah, and how it has that kind of attitude of, what do you think that they do in the Soviet Union? Like they're trying to make money too, or like they're trying to, they plan things in this management style way or something, and I feel like that's kind of the attitude. It's like, where, it's like you've got like a racket going, and it's not just a racket. It's also like it's like an ideology around it that justifies the sort of being in charge. And then, people that are trying to like actually win the game, say, like in terms of like, say, totally conquer all of your enemies and all of this kind of stuff. They're the ones that are the dupes in a certain way, kind of like they're the dumb ones, because it's like, it's like, if you're a crime lord or something like that, your goal shouldn't be to completely dominate every crime racket that you can or anything like that. Yeah. It's basically to just live a good life, within your kind of system, or even get out of it if you can, kind of thing, somehow just coast kind of thing, instead of,
get away with it.
Yeah, get away with it instead of just try to be, and I think that that's especially true with all the intelligence agency kind of stuff, where it's like, or even like crime, like if you're thinking about like with cartels or something, the goal of like the FBI or something like that shouldn't be, it's not, or like these other groups and stuff, it's not really get rid of all of drugs in the United States or something like that, right? It's just manage the chaos kind of stuff. So.
Manage the chaos, absolutely.
No, I think you always need like part of it is like the fractionalism, and in fact, it wouldn't function like without it. Like you need the tension, like the discord, like the convergence happens through it in a way. Like if you think about it, like if the Yankees need the Cowboys and the Cowboys need the Yankees, like if either one of these sides accomplish their goals, like what would they do? Or like if the right wing in America like won everything, like what would their whole lives revolve around? Like the same thing with like if either of these factions like somehow
it's
were
really
victorious,
you're right. Like I hate to do it, but like didn't a certain Joker once say like you couldn't exist without me, Batman? And not to overturn that, but I think it's rooted so deeply in American culture. It's like the fundamental dialectic, like that you can project onto like the baddie, or basically you see it. So I mean, it's Coke and Pepsi, it's Republicans and Democrats, it's Batman and Joker. They are just always going to fight each other. You can't really. The explanation for the existence of one doesn't really work without the existence of the other. And you saw after the Cold War, after, the communists were basically vanquished, that we had to scramble pretty quickly. I think everybody implicitly kind of understands that now, that we couldn't go much longer than a decade without finding a new Joker to basically rail against eternally. And we did, in terms of like Islamic terrorism, which the CIA or factions thereof basically created. So...
Yeah, and I mean, really, I think that what you're describing is basically like Hegelianism, which is very fundamental to, even when you talk about dialectics, that's very fundamental to like all frameworks for understanding the world, like both on the left, especially on the left, but also very much on the right. Hegel's influence is great, like in terms of the hermeneutics on the right. Evola, like you could see Hegel's influence on him there, Spengler. Yeah, exactly. Oh, very much Spengler. So exactly. And I think that with Batman and Joker, that's what you have. You have basically, Batman's very grim and he's shadowy, and Joker's like very bright and like, but Batman's somehow good and Joker's bad,
Batman's also literally like an industrial scion who, like, his dad is like all wrapped up in like the defense industry, and he basically lives in Chicago, and like the Joker's kind of like a mafia boss kind of, and it's actually, I don't know, not to get too deeply into like Batman, but you could almost see like the Operation Underworld stuff that Oglesby talks about in his book, like the deep relationship between the national security state and the FBI and the mafia, starting mainly in World War II, with a little bit before, and Meyer Lansky's like close relationship with Fulgencio Batista, going back to the 1930s, and then the immense geopolitical importance of Cuba, that to both the mafia and the U.S. national security state, that they are kind of Batman and Joker, in a way, it kind of lines up.
I mean,
in terms of,
yeah, on one hand, like, it's something that we encounter a lot, like, with these cultural phenomena that actually have great importance, such as, like, theatricality, like, art, culture, the other aspects of culture, film itself. There's kind of, like, a pall over them, or even religion. There's a pall over them where it's like, that's not serious, don't want to talk about it. But, if you think about it, there probably is some reason why, like, American culture is so deeply obsessed with Batman and the Joker. Like, if you think about it, there's probably something deep going on in terms of, like, this incredible overriding fixation with these two characters,
and it also it makes Batman, it really dodges a lot of suspicion away from who Batman really is and what the hell he's up to, because he's actually, if you just look at him objectively, like if you look at Batman on the level of going around beating up muggers and stuff like that, he's an absolute psychotic fascist. He's
guy. Zimmerman. He's Jordan Zimmerman.
Yeah, he's a vigilante.
Yes.
He's a vigilante.
George Zimmerman, yeah.
And so it's like he almost is like, maybe he's a fifth generation son of one of these the Wayne dynasty.
Well, where is Gotham City? Gotham City's definitely, on the East Coast, right?
I guess it is New York. Yeah, Metropolis is more Chicago.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they film it in Chicago. It's very clearly like Chicago when you see it in the movies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah. There was. I mean, that's also Chicago was a huge hub of privatized intelligence services, and and basically, I think it was called the American Protective League in World War I, which was kind of this like quasi official organization that was like ambiguously like deputized by the Department of Justice to root out German saboteurs and anti-war, draft resistor type people. It basically was then used by a lot of the biggest industrial corporations to bust the IWW and like use basically like these deputized people as strikebreakers and like detectives and things like that, like a secret police kind of in a Pinkerton type way. And they had hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and they basically, they went around just like busting up strikes and then calling every IWW person like a German agent and getting them thrown in jail. So...
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredible digression about Batman, but I do think that I do think that it is interesting, because if you think about it in a way, like, most Batman-based media is from like kind of it's Batman positive. It's all about from Batman's point of view. But I think you mentioned, like, if you think about it objectively, he is like George Zimmerman. I mean, he is really not that much more, like, people tend to think, I guess, I really am not super well versed in Batman fandom, but I assume people tend to think Batman is a hero. He's a superhero. He's a good guy. What he's doing is good for the world. But really, like, he is crazy. Like, he's like wearing this costume, and he's going up and he's like, beating up like small time criminals, like based on his own authority, like a lot, like muggers and things like that, or like, maybe even like 12-year-old black kids who are like, idling around a neighborhood or something like that. But yeah, like, so I think that definitely applies to the Yankees and Cowboys as well, where, like, if you adopt one framework, like, it seems like the other side is, like, this maniacal, like, freak, who must, like, be stopped, and, like, the other side is, the only possible solution, like, they alone can fix it. But if you try to step outside of it, then you can see, like, wow, both of these people are insane, and they're just actually... like, or both of these formations or, ideological structures societal and economic structures are insane, and they are actually feeding on each other and doing this eternal dance to the detriment of everyone.
Yeah, which is even more... sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, I can't stop thinking about like racist Batman.
Yeah,
who, like, the movies always kind of portray the criminals very carefully as like 50s style white thugs with like the little caps on and stuff.
Yeah,
but like if you really were to portray that in a modern setting, I'm not so sure that it would always be white people that he would be beating up. And it's just kind of funny to imagine the stories of him like going in and like beating up a bunch of Bloods and Crips or something like that, and people still cheering for it. It's like, wait, well, hold on, he's just beating up a bunch of black people all over the city. I don't know if this is like what we're all about, but if you are just like fighting crime, I think that's kind of what it ends up looking like
yeah, it's actually kind of funny to think about, like, Batman's traumatized because, like, his parents were killed by, like, a criminal, and so now he hates all criminals. Like, I mean, I guess it's lucky that, like, you know, the guy who killed his parents was like, hey, like, look at you, see? Like, give me your pearls or whatever, instead of, like, you know.
It's like, when was the last time anyone talked like that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, just because you brought up Batman's origin story where a bunch of sicko thugs basically came up and, like, robbed his wealthy parents outside of the opera, and, you know, that was, like, his whole origin story. Can I just read, like, a brief, like, 2-paragraph article from the Chicago Tribune from the 1930s? Or, I'm sorry, the late 1920s.
Sure. Okay.
Just because it's, like, too funny not to. This kind of gets to maybe Batman and the Yankees, the Cowboys, everything. So on Chicago on December 8th, three powerful it says a gang raid on Silk Hats. Group returning from Chicago Opera is attacked. Three powerful organizations fighting lawlessness were using their resources today to find 4 men who don't like silk hats. The services of the 3 organizations, the Secret Six, the Association of Commerce Citizens Committee for Prevention of Crime, and the Employers Association, were invoked by Joseph Belden Sr. after 4 ruffians attacked members of an opera party and made away with nothing of value except the silk hats. Quote, we don't like silk toppers, the 4 chorused from a motor car as members of the party, all socially prominent, returned to a residence in fashionable Ritchie Court after the opera. No attention was paid to the shouts, whereupon the 4 men attacked Joseph Belden Jr., William C. Madliner, tore their dress suits and took the silk hats, escaping in the car. Herbert McLaughlin, also a member of the party, attempted to interfere and suffered the loss of his shirt front. So that's like basically Batman's like kind of it's very similar, but it's basically like if you attack socially prominent people, they're going to get the Association of Commerce Citizens Committee for the Prevention of Crime, and the Secret Six, who I looked up, were actually involved in the kind of whole Untouchables, like hunting down Al Capone thing. And basically they're going to like send out vigilance committees to go get these sickos. And so that just made me think of like, oh, that predates probably Batman by about 10 or 15 years. But that kind of thing was going on in cities like Chicago, where these industrialists were getting really into these like vigilant committees and were almost sponsoring kind of like Batman groups to go out and like find these ruffians and stuff. So, you know, there's a lot embedded in kind of the Batman myth, I think, that like there's so many levels you can read into it, but it goes back a bit. And yeah, like having a psycho like the Joker, like a crazy cowboy or an Osama bin Laden kind of figure can basically, you know, direct questions away from like, who is Batman and why should we be standing him why don't you go like stop war or something? I don't know. Like, isn't there so much more you could be doing, Batman, except, you know, I don't know. But anyways.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So let's bring it back to the topic.
Okay, sure.
There was one question. I think like if you're seeking to be critical about this theory, the Cowboy Yankee theory, I think one thing that kind of pops up is like, well, isn't this kind of just Democrats versus Republicans? Mm-hmm. Isn't it basically that in another, you know, just with a slightly different kind of framework? And I was just wondering what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, well, I think that it is, but it's basically a way to say that like one party is kind of inhabited by or used by one faction as the deeper roots of like this thing that we're seeing, and the parties maybe are more superficial on top of that. I think because of course political parties, like he brings us back to the Civil War and things like that, and you know he sees this sort of split in the ruling classes as being a very old phenomenon of American society, and of course the political parties have changed significantly, you know, since that time. So I think that is something that does kind of exist, where these power blocks kind of are associated with the parties, but I think he sees it as being a more superficial layer over that. In, you know, there's structures beneath this. Like I think Howard Hughes' empire is something that is like very vital to the conception of the Cowboys, and it's kind of a structural factor. It's more than just, you know, whatever one associates with the Republicans.
But at the same time, even Oglesby acknowledges that at the time he was writing that book that I think maybe Howard Hughes was one of the final kind of holdouts. He also mentioned, I think, like the Hunt family, the oil family in Texas, and how, you know, at the end of the day, even these cowboys were sending their sons off to Harvard Business School to learn kind of modern technocratic business management theories, and then come back and rationalize their corporate operations and basically fully integrate. So I feel like, to an extent, yeah, I don't know. The Republican and Democrat thing, it's also an interesting, because this was the last era where those parties kind of flipped their constituencies a bit, where the reactionaries in the South finally left the Democratic Party and became Republicans, kind of starting in the 70s and the 80s. And I think that Oglesby's framing, it does a good job of kind of debunking the importance of the two parties. I do actually worry a little bit, though, that he's kind of introducing a deeper kind of red-blue dichotomy that maybe, just like the two parties, is not quite as clean-cut maybe as he presents. If you really get down to like the economic reality of who has the money and the power and who's connected to who. Because I think, you know, just like how we know at a certain level, a lot of the biggest corporations will, to this day, give to both parties, right? Mm-hmm. They'll kind of do a 50-50 split. They might lean a little more in one direction depending on whatever their interests are. But you think, I mean, maybe actually that's different now. Maybe there is a kind of divestment from the Republican Party from certain companies. But if that's only because the Democratic Party now has all of the people that were like moderate Republicans in the 90s practically, right? You know, it's like we've actually almost gone through another shift where, you know, this new, despite how woke the new Democratic Party is, it's, you know, it's so woke that it's open to CIA officials, veterans of the Bush administration, the Cheneys, George Bush, like, you know what I mean? Like they're really
hate has
open.
No home here.
What's that?
Hate has no home here.
Exactly. Yeah, hate has no home here. If you don't like Dick Cheney, you need to interrogate yourself and your own hatred and your own prejudice. Check your
privilege. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, but I do think that I sent you, Tom, and also to Khalid the kind of rebuttal article that was published in late 70s by a guy named Stephen Johnson, How the West Was Won, Last Shootout for the Yankee Cowboy Theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, it was interesting.
It was interesting, yeah. And I think maybe you said before we recorded, Tom, that you felt like maybe he could have been a little more charitable in general to Oglesby.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I got, I didn't read it very carefully. I kind of scanned through it, but my basic takeaway was that he was indicating that the idea of these like distinct socioeconomic bases that form the Cowboys and the Yankees are not quite so distinct at all, actually. And that when you look at who owns what, who has, you know, all that kind of stuff, like what the economic connections and whatnot are, it's much more mixed, and you can't really draw out these like two distinct groups from them. And that's fair enough. And I think we've kind of talked about how that's probably the case, you know, and that people have their varying interests, and it's not really like you would just strictly identify as one side or the other, but rather that you would play within this framework that kind of is built up. I think he overshot a little bit, or was sort of taking aim at too easy of a target there. Like, I think it's interesting data. I think it's very good to kind of like bring that evidence to bear. But I also felt like to use that as like a complete refutation of this idea sort of misses the point a little bit.
Yeah.
But overall, I did like that.
Steve Johnson's critique, I think, for the thrust of it mainly was that the defense industry, which is something that's heavily associated with the Cowboys. You know, that's like one of their like economic bases of power, in theory, is the defense industry. And basically what Steve Johnson showed was that these defense industries are still owned, basically like they can't be the Cowboy Power Foundation, because like really the defense industry is like its ownership structure is still the same as like any other national industrial sector. So it's like mainly owned by big Eastern banks, pretty much, the defense industry is. And so that was like, you know, the basis of his refutation. But I think Oglesby did have a little rebuttal. We read like a sort of a later edition of the book that I think came out like maybe a couple years after the original piece. I don't know where the original piece was published, but in that edition, Oglesby had a little rebuttal to that, and I think that what he said also had a bit of merit, because basically what he brought up was, let me see if I can find it here. He says, the point about ownership is perhaps valid as far as it goes, although I find it strange that the criteria Johnson should set up for cowboyhood, in my sense, should exclude from his cowboy sample the case I have long argued is most archetypal and important, i.e. the Empire of Howard Hughes, see Chapter 6. More important, Johnson ignores the extent to which, in the words of a recent summary, the emergence of the Sun Belt has been dependent on its ability to obtain defense contracts and space exploration installations. I found the space connection to be very interesting and salient today as well. But yeah, he goes on to basically talk about how like the money from these institutions to the defense industry flows to a certain region. You know, he says that the First National Bank of Boston and the Girard Trust of Philadelphia may own Lockheed, but Lockheed's plants are in California, Texas, and Georgia. So I think that's an interesting thing to bring into the picture. You know, like, yes, the ownership structure is relevant, but the geography also has meaning. And I think that is something that, to me, is an interesting... I think that, their critiques back and forth helped each other to develop this further, I think. I think that is a good salient point about geography.
That's cool. Yeah, that's always nice to see when people are constructively kind of building these arguments back and forth instead of just trying to, like, gotcha,
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that, and I thought that it kind of it fleshes out a little bit, that it's almost like I wish Oglesby could have gone back and written a sequel or something, because he focuses on Johnson focuses also on like the personal social kind of backgrounds of the top executives of all these different corporations, and he tries to actually find kind of, is there a difference in kind of society? Because if these are kind of two different groups of elites, like maybe they wouldn't go to the same universities, they wouldn't be involved in the same fraternal organizations or secret societies and stuff. And basically he did find that for the most part that, let's see, the membership of people who went to the most elite colleges, I think in industrial corporations, the rate is 40%. The defense corporations have 31%. And club membership is actually 70. They're almost equal. It's 77 and 78% respectively. And, they break down like how many of them all went to basically the top like 15 colleges that are considered kind of the most elite, Harvard, Yale, and I think probably Princeton being among them, as well as, Stanford and a few others. And it's like once you get to that level, there isn't much difference in terms of the social background. Now, some of these
doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
But there's definitely the narcissism of small differences, though.
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
like
Families
Yale people
fighting,
and Harvard
right?
people don't like each other. Yeah, exactly. Like Princeton. Yeah, exactly. They don't like Harvard or Yale. They like those three like hate each other the most, even though like they're more similar than probably the other top 15, but yeah.
That's the other thing, is I think we don't want to make the mistake when we're looking at, say these families or something, like, I don't know, like Richard Bissell and, Dulles and Bush all like, being in college together in 1844. We don't want to assume that all of these families are not houses divided against themselves either, because, especially when you start to get this much money, this much intergenerational wealth involved, and then it spreads out among descendants, and it's been doing that apparently, since at least the 19th century, you're going to have some issues, you're going to have some feuds, and then, different relatives are going to, split off to different parts of the country. That's something I've found in my research that is kind of complicated a little bit of the Yankee thing, was that I didn't quite realize how many of these elite Yankees from like New England were going out west in the kind of mid 1800s to places like Chicago and San Francisco and Cincinnati and St. Louis and Detroit and places like that. And they almost had like the first movers advantage, because they already had some capital. They were probably, well educated, socially connected, and were able to get into various industries at the kind of ground level, just like how a rich kid could have kind of wandered into Silicon Valley with, some money from their trust fund and boom, like invested in a few things, and now they're actually rich. And then all you hear about is how they're a successful tech person. You don't hear about, that's kind of the real like intergenerational economic privilege that has been at play. And so I guess, the Yankees didn't just stay in basically, the Northeast. And, because Oglesby points out the Southerners, partially as a result of losing, their economic system after the Civil War, like a lot of them did kind of go out west. But I think even more so, it begs the question, like, well, the Yankees were the victors, and then they were kind of pretty much the prime movers in things like the railroads and like the infrastructure and all that stuff. So they would have been even more well positioned to basically go out and found the very earliest kind of cities and industries and stuff. And, the like well before the Cold War and the defense industry as we knew it today. So, it just complicates it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
But all this nuance goes out the window if we're trying to draw like a genealogical connection between like someone evil and like someone today who we don't like. Then like, everything is homogenous and all families like are extremely close with each other. And anyone who you've ever spoken to or in a picture with, like they're your best friend or your grandfather. Yeah. But other than that, it's very nuanced.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I think this kind of goes without saying, but like this is just a good case example of how just because there's like two sides to something doesn't mean one is the good side.
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
That you want to root for it. Like you don't want to start thinking like, who's the anti-imperialist tactical ally between the Cowboys and the Yankees? Like that doesn't work like that,
Yes, sure. Exactly. Yeah, very much true.
Sometimes it's Alien versus Predator,
Yeah.
Yeah, and we all lose.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not sure if we want to get into this a bit, but I'd suggested, Tom, is that like we haven't really gone over much of the like core top level premise of the book kind of thing in terms of the assassination of JFK and the downfall of Nixon. And I don't know if we just want to skim over that a bit kind of thing, get it so that people that know more about what what this is directing, like what the networks are pointing towards in terms of events in American history.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think, we're kind of coming to the end here. I think this would be a good kind of, I thought that the Subliminal Jihad episode goes over that very well.
Okay.
So I think people can definitely go to that for more, but maybe you guys could provide like a really quick summary, maybe kind of almost like a teaser for people to entice them to kind of explore more with your episode on the topic.
Yeah, the Dallas stuff is pretty, you might be familiar with it if you've seen like a movie like JFK, like his discussion of it, it's all through like the Yankee Cowboy hermeneutic, so it's interesting in that respect, and it talks about, Kennedy's position like between these groups trying to negotiate them, like his being forced out and things like that. But in terms of like how it went down, like you probably are familiar with the broad strokes of like the kind of JFK conspiracy theory. The Watergate stuff is a little bit more interesting because it talks about like the sabotage of the what was the name of the flight? I don't know if you remember Dimitri.
I forget the flight, but Dorothy Hunt.
Dorothy Hunt's plane. Yeah, exactly. And there's some compelling stuff there. That's a whole aspect to the Watergate stuff. So it's not just like sort of setting up this scandal and everything so much as or it isn't just that, but it's also like this, massive plane sabotage that he goes into at great length in his sort of formulation of this. And it talks about Howard Hughes extensively and his various connections to the Cowboy Network.
And also like chapter. Meyer Lansky. It does run through both because Nixon had mob connections going back to World War II, but like the kind of Meyer Lansky syndicate mafia involvement. Also going back to World War II and like their deep integration with the CIA and kind of the very highest compartmentalized levels of the CIA. These people like, John J. McCloy or Richard Bissell or potentially, Ted Shackley, George Bush, whatever. And how it was kind of a coalition of groups, including the kind of cowboy faction that was mad. I think primarily, Noam Chomsky will get pissed, but it was because of Vietnam, Oglesby argues, that basically Kennedy got hit. And he was also pissing off a lot of people. I think he was putting tariffs on steel. He was putting like price controls on steel. And, U.S. Steel, I think, goes back to Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, very powerful. Not necessarily, that's more of a Yankee thing. So I think actually Oglesby does say that Kennedy was also kind of pissing off his own people, his own northeastern allies, and doing things that they didn't like. And I think I personally, the idea that he might try to negotiate an end to the Cold War with Khrushchev in the mid-'60s was potentially a major tripwire that would have really messed up the game for both the Yankees and the Cowboys. And so, they had to do it.
We discussed this issue extensively, on our episode, why Kennedy was assassinated, to what extent, we could expect that he would have, how he would have handled the Vietnam War. I think we can definitely say that it would have been differently. How exactly it would have shaken out, I think it's difficult to project, but there's also other reasons that are offered for the potential motive. And I think Dimitri makes a good point that he was kind of trying to appease both factions. He was trying to appease the cowboy thirst for anti-communist, outflanking, and also, to be more conciliatory. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to have it both ways. So he had I forget what he calls it, but it's qualified cowboyism. His Bay of Pigs attempt was a failed sort of cowboy appeasement strategy.
Special war.
Yeah. Oh, right. The special war. That is very interesting. Yeah, because there's I think there's a great parallel between what Kennedy did in terms of Vietnam, where he was kind of trying to, do a sort of hedge himself a little bit, trying to hedge it, where he would just send in Green Berets and special forces. It's very interesting to draw a parallel between that and the sort of now what you might call the Yankee or Atlanticist penchant for drones and things like that, surgical type of war where, it's not messy, it's not blowing everything up, but of course, it's horribly violent and it's all an illusion. But
right.
It's still,
and as you mentioned before, Obama's death squads and all, or death.
Yes.
What his hit list or whatever he had.
Yeah, his disposition matrix. Yeah, exactly.
Right,
That's very
matrix,
Kennedy type thinking. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Surgical.
So.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of things in there that we get into in our episode if people want to check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic. Really great listening. I'm a big fan of your podcast generally, but I thought that episode in particular was really fascinating. So I encourage everyone to check it out.
Yes, and feelings mutual. We are big You Can't Win fans. Like I was saying to you guys before we started recording, definitely your format that you pioneered and invented of two guys talking to each other, was a real big influence on us. Yeah.
Sure.
And the Q&As, let's not forget.
Yeah, right. The questions. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, speaking of, maybe we should get into that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to get into questions now. The first one is Glenn Greenwald, ?
Yeah, so I guess just general impressions or opinions about Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
I mean, I used to be pretty chill with Glenn Greenwald. I appreciated it when, I hate Bill Maher, so I appreciated it when he told Bill Maher to shut up, But since then, I don't know. I feel like he is just gone down. He's become very myopic and hyper focused on certain things, and I think that he's drifting into an interesting direction that I'm not too horribly outraged by, but I also just find very tedious in general. So I don't know. He's also a bit sus with Snowden stuff. I don't know. Dimitri probably has a
I was curious what Dimitri would say about that.
I too was a fan of Glenn Greenwald in my younger years, going back to the Salon days in the 2000s. I always thought, oh, he's pretty good. And the Snowden stuff, at the time I thought, oh, pretty cool. Wow. I believed the whole kind of story. And then the Intercept after that. But, once the Intercept era kind of got going, I did my sus radar, maybe it was getting more refined over these years, but it's a lot with the Snowden stuff susses me out and feels like it was kind of a production. It didn't happen the way that with this breathless narrative with Laura Poitras and the hotel room in Hong Kong and oh my God, I got to put a hoodie over my laptop because there could be a camera in here spying on me. Just there's a lot of melodrama around it, and I would agree with Khalid that his more recent iteration, even though I think he was right more or less about Russiagate, and I didn't mind anything he was saying about that. So it's this weird thing where like people are often trying to cancel him when he says something that I more or less agree with, but then he also runs off and does a lot of other stuff. Not saying he should be canceled, but he does a lot of like, he just does some sus shit sometimes and like acts like the way he frames things. You know, he comes out of this ACLU background. He defended all those Nazis, which is something that I feel like he doesn't really honestly. I'm very kind of down on the kind of ACLU kind of I just heard Amy Goodman, of course, say it like the other day in like a Pacifica promo of like, you may not agree with like what I'm saying, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. And it's like, okay. Like, I'm not all about like, yes, let's go cancel people and like regulate speech, and I think a lot of that is sus, but the flip side of that like really utopian ACLU thing that goes to the extent of like, I will defend like skinhead Nazi like murderers in court because like they deserve him. It's like, okay, bro, I don't know, like chill. Like, yeah, maybe if he did it once, but I think he did it multiple times, and he's still kind of flirting with. He's also a kind of guy that broadcasts himself as kind of like a leftist, but he's really more of a libertarian. He always has been. Right. He's been more of like a kind of a little more of like a more socially liberal Ron Paul guy is how I would probably best describe him. And I don't think he's ever really changed that much from it.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. I mean, you know, if that's your thing, do your thing. You know, I got no problem with it. As long as it's like you know what you are and we know what you are. You know what I mean? Like, fine. You know, there's going to be things you agree with and there's going to be things you disagree with, and that's fine. But yeah, like you were saying, the Snowden stuff seems really kind of like this isn't the whole story here, you know? Yeah. Even maybe it is a positive thing, like on balance or something, but there's something kind of not right. Doesn't smell right.
Yeah, most of what was released with him like was stuff that people already knew if they were paying attention. It was just like something that was so shocking because there was, as Dimitri said, the whole production around it, you know. But
and meanwhile,
that's how a lot of this stuff seems to work.
Yeah, and all the stuff that Snowden allegedly gave them, and who knows how much he actually gave them, was never released by The Intercept. And then I think like they slow walked it for years, and then I think maybe in 2018 or 2019 we're just like, yeah, we're just not going to release the rest of them. But you know, when they came out, they were like, we're going to do a series of articles on this for like the next couple years, and we're going to vet them. He also had a little bit of a fetishism of kind of taking the national security state's kind of complaints at face value of like, we're going to go through and we're going to comb through all of this information to make sure that it like never jeopardizes like sources and methods or gets like a CIA contractor killed in the field. And it's like, I don't know, like, you know, I get that would open you up to maybe some legal kind of issues, but he almost seemed to be embracing that as an ideal. God forbid we would ever want, JSOC operatives to be endangered while they're, like plotting to double tap drone strike a wedding in like Yemen or something. You know, it's just kind of like, dude, like, are you outraged at the war machine, or are you not that outraged? It's in that weird kind of Green Party liminal kind of area. Maybe not Green Party, but still, there's I don't know. There could have been a lot more you could do with that type of stuff, and I think Khalid's right. Like, there wasn't really that much. I mean, the New York Times reported on it in like 2005 or 2006, like the warrantless wiretapping thing, and just people kind of didn't care. And you could even argue that people didn't really care about.
They still didn't care. Thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, only very few people cared. Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, there's far worse people in the world, and yeah, his whole thing is tedious. For mostly, that's the main thing, is that like I just find a lot of what he talks about now to be like kind of besides the point a lot of the time, where he has these sort of fixations that are really more about like what's going on in his own life or his feelings about his own self-expression, I guess, and feeling that he should be able to do that, and everything kind of revolves around. It's a common problem where things get stuck into this vortex of like, I'm being silenced or whatever, but I wouldn't be going on Tucker every night. I feel like that's like, just dumb. Like, come on. Like, that I feel like is not on the level where like, are you seriously acting like this guy is like a sincere actor for anything good in society, like that it's worth lending your voice to like his agenda?
Probably CIA. His dad like ran Voice of America in the 80s, and it's super sus. Like, it's not so good. Yeah.
He's basically become the stand-up comedian that goes on Rogan and complains about cancel culture for 2 hours.
He really has.
Yeah.
Which is like, to me, like my strongest opinion about cancel culture is that like the discourse around cancel culture is just like so incredibly like enervating and boring. Like that's the most boring thing, and like it drives me crazy how like everything gets sucked into it, and there are so many things where like people are talking about one thing, but you can tell they're really talking about like quote unquote wokeness or cancel culture. I mean, Don had a tweet that, you know, something that I felt for a long time, which is that, like, you almost miss SJW now that, like, they've got their hands on the term woke, you know? Like, you're pining for the days of SJW, you know? It's just, like, this... Yeah, it's very, very exhausting and stupid.
Totally. The only other thing I'll say real quick about Glenn Greenwald is, given that the Joe Rogan thing is a very apt thing to point out, and also Tucker and the types of people that are kind of circulating in that kind of that particular media like kind of ecosystem, it's all given me very big Peter Thiel vibes. And I feel like at some point maybe Glenn Greenwald got invited to that, you know, that proverbial dinner party in the Hollywood Hills that I've heard Peter Thiel has been, you know, bringing in all kinds of, you know, culture figures that, including like Tom O'Neill, the guy who wrote the Chaos Manson book. He threw a dinner party for him and invited all these other famous people. Yeah, I heard that on...
That guy went on Rogan as well.
Oh, did he? Yeah, he did. Oh, you're right. And they've been talking about that book, and I heard that on Bret Easton Ellis's podcast, who was at the dinner party. So he hangs out there as well. Okay. And he's had Anna from Red Scare. He's had, I think, maybe Brett Weinstein. Like, there's...
Yeah, I've heard Tim Dillon talk about that stuff, who I think is also kind of trying to get into that circle if he's not in it already. So,
interesting.
Dillon's an interesting guy to listen to about this kind of stuff.
He is. He's kind of in a 1 foot in, 1 foot out kind of way with the kind of this scene of people like Elon Musk, like Dave Chappelle, like Joe Rogan, like all these people in Austin and then in LA. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just getting a whiff of that from Greenwald, perhaps, with his current focuses.
I remember we had a question for our show about Mark Fisher's exiting the Vampire Castle. And, you know, it's a relatively old essay. It's very popular, but it was shocking to me how much of that was really about like complaining about like cancel culture, you know, or like people on Twitter like being mad at you for being white. Like the Vampire Castle was like Twitter where like, you know, people aren't fair to you if you're white, or so. It was just really it's bizarre.
I was never really impressed with that essay.
No, I agree.
I liked Mark Fisher's blog back in the day. Like he was an interesting kind of guy, but it was like not any more so than any random, you know, left Twitter, weird Twitter type guy.
Yeah, but he's like the most cited dude on kind of the newest generation of podcasts over the last maybe 3 or 4 years. And I mean, I guess maybe it's just because he was floating around, but it's always jumped out at me that, and maybe because he died, but it's like so many people reference Mark Fisher, or have a kind of like their Fisher pill, or have like a Fisher kind of orientation that will kind of come up like sooner or later. And I mean, he's got some interesting stuff, but it doesn't quite feel like this towering, like, oh my God. But it does kind of mesh with the kind of, oh, I'm a leftist, but I'm also pissed off about cancel culture kind of vibe.
Yeah, I think that essay's appeal can be reduced to the fact that people like the image of a vampire castle, and also it's short, so like people who don't read can read it, you know, or at least like can kind of muddle through it.
I when that essay came out, I remember I said that I would never read it because I thought that the image of a vampire castle was childish. People, and probably the most, like, in terms of like on my own Curious Cat or Ask FM, like over the years, like people would message me ever so often about it, being like, please read that essay, and I would always answer like, I'm not doing that because it's you know, it's a childish thing to talk about. So that's I'm glad that I stuck on that, but I don't know. I know a lot of people that I trust that really like that kind of stuff, but yeah, I don't know where it goes. But with Glenn Greenwald, for myself, like I only really know about him from like posting and stuff, you know, like that. Like I don't really like. I haven't read much about the Snowden stuff or anything like that, but like for me, like I'm not in a good position to criticize someone for being irritating on the computer, kind of thing. Like
that. True.
That's like I get that. I get that.
Out of your own eye. Yeah, exactly.
I get the fun in that, and That's what I look at it as. I almost, the other day I almost muted him just because of the like it was getting a bit too irritating.
Yeah.
But he's having fun on the computer.
Yeah.
I think that's the idea.
Yeah, I mean, people criticize him for going on Tucker Carlson, but if you were invited to go on Tucker Carlson, I mean, wouldn't you do it just for the fun of it? I mean, I don't know. Like,
maybe once.
Once. But then, like, if you haven't been disinvited, like after your one appearance, like you're doing something wrong. Like, in my opinion, like that guy who went there and then like called him out for like the incredible hypocrisy of like his whole bit when he's like totally owned by like the Murdoch and just like spews talking points. Like that is, I think, a reasonable Tucker Carlson appearance. But if you're like one of his regular stable of like left punchers, like, again, there's way worse people in the world. Like, you got to make a living, but I disapprove of that aspect of Glenn Greenwald myself. But.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. And he's gotten into the whole gender stuff, like about trans women and lesbians and all this. And some people have been really outraged and offended by the stuff he's been saying, but I don't agree or disagree. I have no horse in that race whatsoever. So to me, it's just like another wacky argument to just toss into the ring. I mean, I don't know. This is kind of my hot take on all this, I guess, is like, I don't know. It makes as much sense as any of the other things people are saying about this stuff to me. So it's like, all right, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, it's more of his tone that I really find annoying, honestly. Like, again, like, 50% at least of things that he says, like, I totally agree with. But it just has this, like, manic energy being like, oh, so you think that people should be silenced? Like, so like, it's just like, chill, dude.
Totally.
Like, chill,
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we get into the next one?
Yeah.
Have humans ever landed on Earth, or is it fake?
Earth? Like...
Yes.
Are they talking about humanoid ETs from, say, another planet that have landed here?
I guess the only way that you could say no to this question is if you interrogate the meaning of the term Earth, human, or landing. Like, outside of, like, the normal idea. Like, I guess maybe we haven't landed because we're always been on Earth, so there's no land to make, except for, like, when we're born.
Yuri Gagarin landed on Earth.
Yeah, he landed back on Earth. Yeah, I guess that's true.
I mean, technically, every astronaut that's gone out and come back is technically
they landed on Earth. That's true.
But yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, maybe we didn't land on Earth, but the Earth landed on us.
Oh, but did Yuri Gagarin land on the Earth, or did he touch down on the water?
I think they mostly touched down on the water. So no, but now the space shuttle lands like on a runway. So technically,
well, I guess if you just jump in the air, then you land on the Earth.
Yeah, but I think, are they getting it? Are there like humanoid ETs? Because there's the planet Phaeton, of course, that is now the asteroid belt, and according to certain Soviet ufologists, was exploded in a catastrophic thermonuclear war that exploded the planet, and the survivors who were like on a space station flew to Earth and landed their rocket down with like the nose pointing upwards, which is why all of our religious buildings have like a parapet or a spiral tower or something, because it's like the rocket.
Well,
and then they taught us everything that they knew about human civilization, and we worship them as gods, etc. That's one take.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it doesn't contradict the Quran, I'm willing to consider it.
I don't know if that does.
I guess Adam and Eve landed on Earth, right? Because
that's
it could
what
be
I was
seen
thinking.
as being landed. Yeah, so that's definitely not fake. So yeah, there you go.
Sure. Very curious questions on our... So we'll wrap it up with this one. Tom, is there an Islamic version of the Book of Genesis? And if there is, how did it start? Just
so
curious,
crazy we were just talking about that. Sorry.
Just curious, because in the Bible, God first makes himself perceived through sound. This was pointed out to me, and as a guy who's really into music, I thought that was cool.
So there's a lot of ways to kind of view this that would change my answer, I guess. And Khalid, you can kind of help me out with this one. as a in terms of like, is there a book of Genesis? Like we don't have, like Muslims, we don't have like different books like the Bible does. We just have the Quran. It's a single text.
Yeah, well, there's surahs that are divided, Hadith, but that's after the fact, pretty much. Like,
sure.
Yeah.
But and then the surahs themselves are not. You can't think of them in the same way like you can as the books of the Bible. Right, like they will have themes, like organizing themes and principles and even stories and stuff. Like there's Surah Yusuf, which is pretty much just a straight telling of the story of the prophet Yusuf or Joseph. Mm-hmm. But many of the surahs are they're almost like poetic. They can be very short, and that it's almost just like an imagery that's presented or just some statements about the nature of God or something.
And the Quran that we have, it's very different because it is basically like a transcribed recitation of Allah's words by the Prophet. So but so it, like, it's put together in different ways. The way the Quran that we usually have is organized is not like, doesn't start with Genesis the way that the Bible does. It starts with Al-Fatiha, which is the thing that we say most often during prayer, and then it has the longest surahs to the shortest. So it's not even in chronological order in what the Prophet recited. And even within surahs, there's some parts that are from different parts of the Prophet's sort of mission and then the revelation of the Quran. Like it's not all like what he said one day or even 1 month. There could be part of a surah. They're like grouped together after the fact by later Muslims, based on like we said, themes or things that kind of seem to go together. But there are, I think, another way to answer that is maybe that there definitely are accounts of creation, although, there's different sort of accounts of anthropogenesis, or the creation of humans in the Quran. And it does talk a little bit about God creating the earth and heaven a lot at various points. But there's not like a book of Genesis. I don't know what you would say on that.
Yeah. Dawn, can you read the question again, the part where it talks about, maybe I misheard, but it says God created himself. Is that something?
Just curious, because in the Bible, God first makes himself perceived through sound.
Oh, first makes himself perceived.
Are you talking about in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word, because that's not Genesis.
That's how I'm reading
Genesis is...
that's the book. That's the book Gospel of John.
Yeah, that's the beginning of John. Genesis is like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
And I correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle, maybe you can remember something, but I don't recall anything along those lines of like the anything very similar to that in the Quran or in Hadith.
Well, there's different like accounts of like sort of God's ontology and how like but I don't think that God is something that has always existed. He's the necessary existence. So there's no... But I think that... I don't know necessarily what the question asker is saying is that God, he created himself through sound. I think that maybe he's saying God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. But then it also says the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So maybe he let himself be known through movement, first of all, or even through the act of creation of the heaven and the earth, which is the first thing that he does. So I don't know. But
although, Frank Zappa used to say music is just moving, vibrating molecules around. So that sound is a form of movement.
That's true. Yes. And moving upon the face of the waters, that could be but I think that, there's many different like Hadith traditions that might talk about things like this. And there's very many philosophical or Sufic accounts of like the or like originary creation and the early phases of God's creation and the creation of the world and the creation of important figures such as like Adam, the sort of prototypical man, and also Muhammad, the prototypical prophet who, there's a famous hadith, like I was a prophet when Adam was between water and clay, so there's all these very interesting ideas, but anyway, there definitely isn't anything about like God creating himself, and the whole thing of God said, "Let there be light." I mean, in the Quran, God is definitely represented in terms of light, like in the famous light verse, but there isn't quite a parallel to that that comes to mind.
But just in terms of sound, I think that like for someone who's maybe interested just in like the concept or the aspect of sound as it relates to God and religion and things like that. I think there's a lot going on in Islam that might be interesting.
Yes.
Just the way that revelation comes down to Muhammad, and the fact that like he there's hadith that talk about the physical phenomena that he experienced when that happened, that there was a buzzing or a humming kind of sound, like a bell, kind of like the low frequency of a bell being struck, that kind of happened as he was receiving inspiration in that way.
Yeah.
And that he hears it, right? Like he's being he received it. The Quran is a very auditory thing.
Yes, he received it different ways. There's different accounts of how he received it, and I think that he got it in different ways on different occasions. But I mean, the first word that he heard was like ikra, like read, which is an interesting word in and of itself, because it both means like to read, but also to recite, like to speak and to hear in a way.
Right, and the word Quran comes
Quran,
from Iqra.
Exactly.
Like you can see the root there.
Yeah, the recitation, So it is definitely an oral thing. And of course, the Quran has like a melody to it. I think that part of the divinity of the Quran is actually in the way that its, sound travels through from the prophet, like through to us today, and like the way that we all experience in our recitation and our prayers. That's part of the way, that we experience Quran. It's not just like, a book in a way. I do remember this one, I don't know if this contradicts what I've just said in a way, but I don't think it really does. But, you're talking about the revelation to him. And I remember this, really something that always has stuck with me is from Ibn Ashaq, the sort of famous seerah, the most famous seerah of the prophet, where he gets his first revelation. And, it was like, Jibril, or the angel Gabriel, like came and like hugged him so like tightly, and he felt like, he says, I felt like I was going to die, and then he felt like, the words were like inscribed upon his heart as if they were a book, and that has always stuck with me. So it's, it's also an interesting sort of metaphor of writing that interacts with this, but that I find interesting as well. I don't know, but anyway.
Right. Yeah. And then like nature is called a book. Like
exactly.
Creation itself is a book. The sort of like eternal timeline of all events is a tablet that is already written.
Yes.
All kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, it's great how like the ayah of the Quran is like, that's the same word, like the signs, like a verse of the Quran is called an ayah or a sign, but also like things in nature are called signs. So the whole like, nature itself is definitely rendered in the same terms as a book. But definitely if you look at the Quran, there's all sorts of things like involving sounds that you can hear. If you go to corpus.quran.com and you look up, hear or listen or sound, I'm sure that you can find all sorts of stuff. Or, the Arab, if you, maybe use Google, or if assuming that you don't speak Arabic, maybe you do, but, you can find the equivalent words and search. You'll definitely find,
Cool. Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there for today. Thanks guys for coming on, and that was a lot of fun. I don't know. Learning that stuff. I mean, it always feels, whenever we talk about something that's like in the sort of conspiracy territory, it's fun and it's sort of exciting, but it's also like, I always feel like it's talking about stuff that's like, like war and crime. And I don't know. Like, it's like, I don't know. We have to take I don't know, but it's good. So thanks for going on.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, it's definitely fun. Yeah, good to be on again. Happy to come on whenever. Definitely always a great experience.
Sure. Yeah, it's always great having you on, Khalid, and I really enjoyed having you on too, Dimitri. We'll have you guys back on again at some point. I really enjoyed this episode. And again, their podcast is Subliminal Jihad. It's definitely one of my favorites, and I would highly recommend everyone go check it out if you found this conversation interesting.
Right on.
And if you liked You Can't Win, you can get a second episode every week by subscribing to our Patreon, and you'll get that as well as access to our Discord, where you can chat with us in our lovely community. And if you want to send us anonymous questions to answer at the end of the episode, you can do that by going to our Twitter account @YouCan'tWinPod, and there's a link to the Curious Cat where you send in your questions pinned up there, so you can do it through that. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
All right, thanks. Peace.